Man buns, oh yeah. Anyway, moving right along.
Yeah,
I think we're on verse 12.
we are.
I'm sure he has.
What's that?
But he's had a ponytail.
Yeah, only when the therapist comes and does my neck.
Alright. Yes, 33, verse 12.
I put my beard in a ponytail once.
I don't want to know about it.
I got two beards.
Okay, you'll recall that where we had left off Wednesday night, that Esau and Jacob had reconciled with each other, and Jacob had presented him with that overwhelming gift of several hundred head of livestock. Esau tries to give it back. Jacob says, no, I want you to keep it. In all probability, part of Jacob's insistence that Esau keep it, which I'm sure both of them at least were thinking about, but maybe not willing to say it, is that was probably Jacob's way of compensating Esau for his earlier theft of his birthright.
I was gonna say that was just guilt.
Probably so. But the other side of that is if Jacob has genuinely had an experience with God and God has changed him, then one of the first things that Jacob would have been thinking about is who have I wronged in the past and how am I going to fix it? And
Time to make it right.
trying to make it right. So obviously they make up with each other, and at this point, as they're getting ready to go their separate ways, verse 12 says, or then Esau said, let us take our journey and go, and I will go before you. In other words, let's all continue on now, and we'll turn around and head back southward. Now, at this point, and this is where my map comes in handy here. Keeping in mind that Esau's home by this point is down here in the mountainous wilderness area. And as he had gone north, Jacob had come south. Now, right up here is where the Jabbok River is, and Jerusalem was about here, Jericho there. They would have continued south, and their encounter with each other would have occurred somewhere in this general area here, to the northeast of Jerusalem. Of course, at that day and age, it probably was still called Salem at the time, but that's really not part of the story. But for what is important for Jacob is at this point, he is still east of the Jordan River. And Canaan, which is where God had told him to go back to, is everything over here on this side of the river. Esau lives on that side of the river. Well, actually, it's not even a river there, because as it becomes the Dead Sea, Esau would have inhabited this area down in here. And Esau, I think, makes the assumption at this point that Jacob is going to follow me back south. That wasn't Jacob's intention. Jacob sooner or later knows that if he's going to do what God told him to do, he's got to get back over here on the west side of the river, because that's where Canaan is. By the way, this area down here, at that time, already was inhabited by Moabites. You had, now in my map here, this is the only map that I could find that had all the various rivers on it. So it's labeled essentially several hundred years later. At that time in history, this area where you see it says Reuben, that would have been where the Ammonites were. Moabites down here, and the Edomites down here. So to head south, they've got to go through Ammonite and Moabite territory, which, by the way, maybe may have influenced Esau as to why he went north with 400 men with him. Now, from Jacob's perspective, if he's got a report that Esau's coming to meet you with 400 men, he's not thinking, oh, that's for our protection. He naturally would have been thinking earlier, he's coming to get me. But there is the possibility, having to pass through Moabite and Ammonite territory, that if Esau had already kind of in his own mind reconciled with his brother, it could have been for protection that he took that little small army with him, because he's got to go through, the territory that belongs to Lot's descendants. But neither we nor Jacob would have known at that point what Esau's motivation was. But what we see here, they've made up. Esau suggests to him, well, let's continue on. And he makes the assumption they're headed south. Verse 13, but he, and this is Jacob, he said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Now, notice at this point, Jacob's probably been, out on the range, so to speak, driving these flocks southward for, by this point, possibly a few weeks. What is this? If we've got sheep, goats, and maybe even a few, donkeys and what have you, that have nursing young, what does that tell us about his flocks?
Young.
Well, not only are they young, but apparently he's had several of them give. What's that?
They burst on the way.
They gave birth on the way. So, I guess the only reason that that's even a point worth taking, consideration of is God's blessing of Jacob and the growth of his livestock didn't end when he left Haran.
And you can't make a lot of time when you got sheep giving birth.
No, you can't. So this definitely would have slowed him down. Now, the fact that Jacob apparently was driving his flocks pretty hard early on in the trip, we saw earlier that based upon the distance and how long he'd been out, potentially 30 miles a day, this tells me that if now that he's got nursing young, they've all given birth within the last few days. And so now with that in the case, now Jacob has an excuse to tell Esau, I can't push these flocks any harder because I got newborn calves to deal with. Which would have made plenty of sense to Esau.
The fact that he drove them so hard when they were coming away from there, they may have birthed early too. So he may not have planned on that.
That's a possibility. But what we do see here is that he definitely has an excuse, a good reason now to tell Esau, you need to go on ahead. I can't keep up with you. I'm going to have to take my time. Verse 14 says, please let my Lord pass on before his servant. Notice he's still, even though they've reconciled, he's still being very, humble toward his brother. Let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will proceed at my leisure according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir. Now, whether Jacob is being deceptive at this point, or if maybe God's redirected him at some point that we're not told about, we can only guess. Jacob definitely tells him, I'm going to continue on in a southward direction, because Seir, although it's not on this map, would have been down in this area where Esau lived. So he's just told his brother, I'm going to follow you southward, but I'll be a little late getting there. So Esau continues on and opens the distance between the two of them. But now, here's another interesting point. Jacob has already given Esau a gift of several hundred head of livestock. But Jacob's got some that have just given birth and are nursing. What about the ones he just gave Esau?
He gave him all the healthy, hardy ones that could hit the road.
Or possibly all the males. Or most of the males. And it's possible that maybe Jacob kept the ones that he knew were pregnant, so that even though that he's given probably half his livestock to Esau, if he kept all the ones that were pregnant, what's going to happen within just a year or two?
Replenished.
He's going to replenish all of them anyway. Jacob's not dumb here. He's got a plan here. But the problem here is, why does he tell Esau, I'll follow you on to Seir, and we'll see in the next verse or two, that's not the direction Jacob goes. What's that?
He's not going to see.
Not even close. In fact, the only way for Jacob to get where he ends up at, Jacob has to turn around and go back northward. He goes in the opposite direction. All right, verse 15 says, and Esau said, please let me leave you with some of the people who were with me. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau offers to leave some of his slaves and servants with him to help out with Jacob's livestock. But Jacob at this point tells him, no, you don't need to do that. Which, either again, Jacob is trusting God, which is possible, or Jacob already knows what he plans to do, even though he's told Esau he's going to follow him southward. And problem is, the Bible doesn't tell us which is the case. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe Jacob knows what his plans are, and at the same time just doesn't want to be a bother to Esau. We just don't know at this point. But it is clear that he tells Esau to keep his servants with him. I don't need them, because at this point also, if half of Laban's servants had offered to stay and continue on with Jacob, at this point Jacob's probably got plenty of help. And if any of Esau's servants go with him, what is Jacob stuck with now?
Tattletales.
Well, more mouths to feed.
I think he was being untruthful, but more diplomatic. If he told Esau, no, I'm not going to go with you, I'm going to go over there, that probably would have created hard feelings.
And it could have. But the question you got to ask yourself is, what kind of hard feelings might have possibly have produced later when Esau realizes that he gets home, days go by, weeks
Jacob's
go
not
by,
coming.
and Jacob's still not there. He realizes then,
Lost some servants.
wonder what happened. Yeah, and if he lost servants that didn't show up, or that they come, days or weeks later and finally get there and say, well, here's where Jacob went. And that may be a possibility as well, that he doesn't want anybody ratting him out as to where he does go.
Has God, in all of this ahead back where we were, has God actually told Jacob that he wants him to go?
Yes, early on, you remember when Jacob is still in Haran and he says God appeared to him that night, God had told him then, go back to the land of your fathers. Well, where is that? Canaan.
Okay,
Yeah, God had specifically told him,
so he knows where he's going.
he knows where he's got to go.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, verse 16, so Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built for himself a house and by the way, the word Succoth actually means booth or house. So whether it was called Sukkoth at that particular time is kind of hard to say. I would venture to say it may have been known by that later, and that's why Moses calls it that when he wrote this, but it kind of hard to believe that it would have been called it that at that particular time, because that word means booth or tent. So he built for himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the place is named Sukkoth. Again, I don't think it was at the time, but now, unfortunately, Sukkoth is not on my map here, but it would have been somewhere in this general area here, or west of the Jordan River. So in order to get back over here, north of the Jabbok River, Jacob has got to turn all of this entourage around, head north again, and he either forded the Jordan River and then headed north, or he forded the Jabbok and then turned and went west across the Jordan. My gut feeling, and again, we don't know for sure, but just knowing what it takes to get livestock and kids and what have you across the river, I tend to believe he probably crossed the Jabbok and then turned and went west across the Jordan. Because north of where the Jabbok River flows in, the Jordan River is known for being pretty shallow, and it's not a wide, difficult river to ford. But at the point where the Jabbok River flows in, you've got now a much deeper river, and it's wider. So it probably would have been dangerous for him to get his people across the Jordan River south of that point. So, in any event, one way or the other, he gets back north, probably a good 20 or 30 miles, and then turns and goes about 20 or 30 miles to the west to end up in this area, and then stays there temporarily. Now, he was there long enough, obviously. He built some temporary shelters for his animals and, his own family and what have you. I don't think that he intended to stay here for an extended period of time, but long enough that it required some temporary shelters. So, if Esau heads this way, Jacob goes north and then west, and this all happened fairly quickly. Again, either Jacob knew this up front when he told Esau, I'll follow you to Seir, or he changed his mind pretty quick. I tend to believe that even though Jacob has been changed by God, he's had a relationship with God, Jacob's still got a little bit of growing room here. Because he lied, I believe, in all probability, lies to his brother. But why would he do that?
You want to make him mad.
Well, I think that's part of it. He doesn't want to make Esau mad, but do you think there's a possibility that deep inside he's still a little, even though he's reconciled with his brother, wonders how much would it take to make him mad again?
Right.
And if Jacob gets mad again and he's got 400 servants with him,
Maybe Esau.
well, that's what I meant, yes, Esau, that he's got 400 men and potentially more than that he could call upon to come meet up with him. Esau could cause some damage. So it tells you that he's reconciled, but maybe it's a shaky reconciliation, that Jacob's still just not sure. If that's the case, then what does that tell us about Jacob's faith?
Kind of shaky.
Yeah. Jacob's had a relationship with God, but his faith is still on shaky grounds.
He wants to get away from Esau.
What's that?
He wants to get away from that man.
Yeah. And the other thing which we're not told here, and again, this is one of those things where you can only guess about the things we're not told, but is it possible that God somehow spoke to him at some point and said, you're not going that way? We don't know. Verse 18. Now Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. Now that is on the map. Shechem is right here. As I mentioned, Succoth is sort of in this general area. So he probably didn't stay there too terribly long. Now, the fact that it says he stopped at Succoth, built booths, but then in the next verse says he went on to Shechem, don't assume that that was like from one day to the next. He could have stayed at Succoth for a few weeks or even potentially a few months before he decided to go from there on to Shechem. That's the one problem with reading what the history that Moses has given for us. Moses is notorious about not really giving us a good timeline. We have to guess sometimes about how long it was. My guess, and this is just my suggestion, is it possible that once he got him as far as, across that river and figured, okay, we're on the other side of the river now, we're safe, we can stop here for a few days or maybe a few weeks until the animals are weaned, and then we move on. Possibility. Because what would prompt him to stay there long enough to build some temporary shelters for the animals, but at the same time know that it was just temporary? What would be going on? His animals are nursing.
Well, they just made a long trip also.
Uh-huh. So, but anyway, from where Succoth was to Shechem would only been maybe another 15 or 20 miles. Probably a couple of days' journey once he decided to move on. But he gets to Shechem, which is notice Moses points out here, this is in the land of Canaan. So he is now at least, he's obeyed God that he's gotten on the side of the river that he needs to be on. Which is in the land of Canaan. When he came from Paddan Aram and camped before the city, and he bought the piece of land where he had pitched his tent from the hands of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Now, if he's bought a piece of land, what does that tell us?
He's settling down.
He's settling down now. He's gotten to an area where he's got some pasture land for his cattle. He's on the right side of the river for the directions God's given him. He's settling in for a little bit.
Is this the only place in the Bible where monetary units are referred to as pieces of money? Because everywhere else that I've ever read in here, it's always shekels, or it's weights of silver, or some other monetary unit that's defined by that custom and that culture. But here it just says pieces of money, at least in my translation.
It does. Not the only place, and keep in mind back then that a lot of these various cultures and people didn't even really have money. All they had was, a certain weight of silver or gold or whatever they were using. Now, if you lived in an area where there was an established government, an empire, for example, Egypt did have, a form of money. But we're living in an area at this point here, before the nation of Israel, when a lot of these city-states, there was no country. Each little town or area was its own individual kingdom. Some of them had money, but most of them didn't. Most of them simply used, commodities to trade back and forth. Barter system. So no, this isn't the only time, but yes, it is a reference that we don't encounter very often. All right, it says, then he erected, this is verse 20, he erected there an altar and called it El Elohe Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. Now, this is another indication that Jacob's planning on settling in for a while. Notice each place that Jacob, and before him Abraham and Isaac, the only places they built an altar was either at a spot where they wanted a memorial to recognize a particular encounter with God, or if it was a place where they were settling for a while. For Jacob to build an altar at this point tells us, and the fact that he's bought a piece of land, he's settling down and planning on staying at this particular spot for a while.
All right, next question. Shechem is apparently an established city that's been there for some time,
It is.
several
Or was.
generations, because it's confusing that the son of Hamor is named Shechem, when you would think that the founding father of the city would be named Shechem. Yet Shechem's father is named Hamor.
Except for the possibility
So he's
that-
several generations of Shechem down the line from the Shechem who founded the city.
Or keep in mind that what if you're a father and you're building a settlement there, and you've got your say a son that you've named Shechem, and you say, what are we going to name the city? Well, do I name it after myself or do I honor my son?
Okay. That's possible.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's an established settlement, but as to how long it'd been there, that we have no way of knowing. Now, I'm sure we could probably look up some archaeological stuff, but as far as the biblical record, we don't really know. Anybody else?
Yeah, just talking about when Jacob was wrestling with God and whatnot, and then he receives the name Israel. It just amazes me that, from my point of view, I think that's when the nation of Israel was established. That's just kind of the way I look at it, because he was named Israel. They just had to populate it now. But 4,000, I think it's like 4,000 years later, Israel is still contending with people. Israel, you can't hardly, if you pay attention to the news at all, Israel's in the news. And it's just amazing to me that God brought this nation up. He created it from one person, maintained it through all those 4,000 years, brought it back to its homeland, and it's in our news every day.
Actually, if you ask any reputable biblical historian about, what proof do we have that there is a God, that's actually one of the things they will point at, is the fact that how many times have empires and individuals over the years, and I say individuals, people like Hitler, for example, or Nero, or you name it, have done their best to try to stamp out Israel. And they have failed again and again and again. And a lot of historians look at that as that in itself is proof that there is a God, that no matter how hard they try, they can't get rid of God's people.
They're the ones who disappear.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones, I always kind of thought that, Jesus is a stumbling block to the Jews, but I really think Israel is a stumbling block to the world.
To some extent, it is. And that's one of the reasons why God has, over the years, He's judged Israel. But each time God has judged Israel, He's always promised them, I will raise up a remnant and you will not disappear. I'll judge you because of your disobedience, but I'll save a remnant. And even in the tribulation period, what's one of the things that we see happen during the tribulation? 2/3 of the Jews get wiped out, and God takes the third that's left, and they turn as a nation their hearts back to God. And then God takes that third of the remnant and rebuilds Israel throughout the millennial kingdom. And at that point is when they realize all the promises of God that they have turned their backs on all up until then.
All the nations around Israel were all Christian nations at one time. And now they're all Muslim. And that puts a black eye on the Muslim nations.
Well, not
Because
only that, but
they can't turn Israel into a Muslim nation.
well, not only that, but if you look at the biblical record, it's the record of future events that haven't happened yet. As we look at Revelation and some of the other, Joel, Ezekiel, some of the other passages that talk about where Israel will be in the future, all of those nations you just mentioned, they're not there anymore. And Israel will have expanded its borders to, like Jordan, for example. If you look here, all the area here that, was actually Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, everything on the east side of the Jordan that Israel occupied in the conquest, well, that's all territory of Jordan now. But in the millennial kingdom, Jordan's gone. It's Israel once again. I think that may also explain one of the reasons why that there's no record of or anything in biblical prophecy that you can point your finger at and say, well, here's the United States. The United States is absent from biblical prophecy. And one of the reasons I think is exactly what you mentioned just a minute ago, Bruce, is that while right now we are one of Israel's, or if not the greatest ally Israel's got, I suspect that the time is going to come in the not too distant future. This country is going to turn its back on Israel, and when it does, we're doomed.
We're toast.
Mm-hmm.
That might be the rapture too, though.
That's a possibility.
That would
Entirely a
be-
possibility.
I vote for that.
You vote for that?
Yeah,
You're hoping for that?
yeah, I'm not.
I did some research recently just out of curiosity, and according to the internet, there are somewhere between 2.38 and 2.4 billion Christians on the planet right now,
Mm-hmm.
and there are 2 billion Muslims. So Satan has been almost as successful as God in getting people to worship him.
Well, but the problem
That's
is
pretty
because,
scary.
because of human nature, that shouldn't be surprising or hard for him to do.
You don't have to.
I mean, look at how successful he's been
Mm-hmm.
Just look how
in
that
turning
came
you
out.
people to him.
No,
It's
I-
scary.
You gotta keep in mind too that, hey, they're cutting people's heads off. With Christianity, you just say, nah, I don't wanna hear that, and nothing else happens to you. You say that to a Muslim and your life is in danger. They
Yes.
basically kill people if they leave the religion.
Right.
It's, you know, intimidation is a pretty effective administration tool, I think.
That is also one of the reasons why I am personally convinced that the one world religion of the tribulation is not going to be an apostate church. I think there will, the Bible says there will be an apostate church, but I don't think it's going to be the one world religion. I think that worldwide religion is going to be, in fact, Islam. And one of the reasons for that is what is the book of Revelation tells us that happens to those who accept Christ during the tribulation period.
They get beheaded.
They lose their heads. Absolutely. They get decapitated. And the Bible also says, and well, I should say Christ himself said, when the disciples asked him, you know, what would happen in the future. This, the Gospels refer to this as the Olivet Discourse, when he basically teaches them about the future. One of the things that Jesus himself said would happen is that the time would come when times and laws would be changed. If Islam is in control, what's one of the first things that gets changed?
Sharia law.
Sharia law. And with regard to the time, we all, you know, most of us probably are aware of the fact that in Islam, they have a different calendar. They don't go by the calendar that we do. That'll be the, you know, the other things that'll get changed is the Islamic calendar will be enforced upon us. We'll find that the date we think it is isn't that date anymore.
The Jews have their own calendar too, don't they?
They do. Yep, it's a lunar calendar.
Yeah, it's something like 57 or 56, something or other.
Yeah. Called Anno Lucas, in the year of light, which they look at as being the year of creation. But now, back to your other point, I think when Israel, or Jacob was renamed Israel, that marks the beginning of the realization of God's promise to Abraham, that it gets focused at that point on Jacob. But if you ask the Jews themselves, when did Israel become a nation? Not when did they become a people. When did they become a nation? They'll tell you, no. No. Not talking about modern Israel. They will tell you that's the Exodus.
The Exodus, yeah.
They became a people exactly when you just said. When Jacob was renamed Israel, at that point, they became a separate people. But what marked them as a nation was the Exodus. All right, anybody else? All right, Miss Mario, all yours.